They blamed her immediately. Not after days, not after questions. Immediately. There was no investigation, no hesitation, no space for doubt. Just silence and time. In that town, everyone seemed to agree on one thing before anyone ever said it out loud. She was responsible. The idea didn't spread loudly. It didn't need to. It moved quietly, settling into people's minds the same way dust settles on old furniture, unnoticed but permanent. No one announced the accusation. No one officially confirmed it. It simply became true. You could feel it in the way conversations ended when she entered a room, in the way eyes avoided hers, in the pauses that grew longer whenever her name was mentioned. The town didn't need proof. It needed a story that made sense. And this one did. The town itself was small, the kind of place where change felt suspicious and familiarity was mistaken for safety. One main road cut through the center, stretching from one end to the other, bordered by a grocery store that smelled of old wood, a post office with fading paint, and a handful of shops that closed earlier every year as fewer people walked past their windows. At the corner stood a church. It had been there longer than most of the houses. Every Sunday, its doors opened to the same faces. People who had watched each other grow old, people who remembered things differently but agreed on what mattered. Everyone knew everyone, and everyone knew her. Her name was Eleanor. She had lived in that town most of her life, long enough to be invisible, quiet enough to be forgotten until she was needed for a story. She never married, never had children. She lived alone and worked nights at the local care home, where the hallways were always dim and time moved slowly. People there described her in the same way whenever her name came up. Quiet, strange, but harmless. She spoke softly. She avoided eye contact. She kept her life small, as if taking up less space might keep her safe. When her shift ended, she walked home under streetlights that flickered more often than they worked, listening to the sound of her own footsteps. No one really knew her, which made it easier. The fire happened on a cold evening in late autumn, the kind of cold that settles into your bones before winter truly arrives. The house stood at the edge of town, separated from the others by a long stretch of road that few people used after dark. It belonged to Thomas Reed. Everyone knew Thomas. He was older, wealthy, respected, the kind of man people listened to even when they didn't agree. His name carried weight in town meetings and church gatherings. When he spoke, people nodded. That night, flames lit up the sky before anyone smelled smoke. By the time the fire department arrived, it was already too late. Inside the house, they found Thomas Reed. He didn't survive. When the firefighters said the blaze was suspicious, people listened. When they said it had been started intentionally, people leaned closer. Someone had done this. And within hours, the town began to fill in the blanks. Eleanor had been there earlier that day. Someone remembered seeing her near the house. Another person remembered an argument, though no one could recall exactly what was said. Someone else remembered her leaving quickly. Memories sharpened as the story formed. By morning, the story had decided itself. They said she snapped. They said she was unstable. They said no one really knew what went on in her mind. The sheriff questioned her once, just once. It wasn't aggressive. It didn't need to be. By then, the town had already reached its conclusion. She denied everything, calmly, quietly. It didn't matter, because in a town like that, truth wasn't decided by facts. It was decided by agreement.
There was no trial. Not because there wasn't time, not because there weren't procedures. There was no trial because no one asked for one. The evidence was weak. Even the sheriff knew that. There were no witnesses, no clear motive, no confession, nothing solid enough to stand in front of a judge for very long. But suspicion didn't need evidence. Suspicion needed agreement. Eleanor lost her job within weeks. The care home said they were making changes. They said it gently, without accusation, without explanation. She nodded, thanked them, and walked out for the last time without asking questions. People stopped greeting her on the street. Some crossed to the other side when they saw her coming. Others pretended not to notice her at all. Conversations would end mid-sentence when she entered a room, as if her presence itself had interrupted something fragile. No one confronted her. No one defended her either. She stopped going to church first. Sitting among people who refused to look at her felt heavier than staying home. Then she stopped shopping during the day, choosing the late hours when the streets were quieter and the lights dimmer. Eventually, she moved. It wasn't far, just far enough. A small apartment just outside town, close enough to hear the distant sounds of a place that no longer wanted her, far enough to be forgotten. No one helped her move. No one visited after. Time passed. Not quickly, not gently. Days blurred into months, months into years. The town continued forward, welcoming new families, repainting old buildings, telling new stories. Children grew older without knowing her name. Old stories faded into background noise. But Eleanor remained where she was, growing older in quiet isolation. She filled her days with routine, simple things, cleaning, cooking, walking the same path at the same hour. At night, she wrote. She kept journals, not to explain herself, not to prove anything. She wrote to remember. She wrote about the fire, about the way people looked at her afterward, about how silence could feel heavier than being accused out loud. She wrote about the sound of footsteps behind her that never belonged to anyone. She wrote about the nights she couldn't sleep, about the way her thoughts circled the same unanswered questions, about the mornings she woke up wondering if anyone would ever ask the right one. And then, slowly, she began writing about something else, something she never told anyone, something she only trusted to paper.
Years later, Eleanor died quietly in her sleep. There was no warning, no struggle, no one beside her. She was found the next morning in her small apartment just outside town. The place was neat, almost careful, as if she had spent years arranging her life to leave as little trace as possible. There was no funeral, no service, no gathering, no familiar faces. No one from town asked questions. No one traveled the short distance to see her one last time. Her passing moved through the system the same way her life had toward the end, quietly, efficiently, without resistance. A social worker was assigned to sort through her belongings. It was meant to be routine. Clothes folded into boxes, old dishes wrapped in newspaper, books placed into stacks, nothing of value, nothing that demanded attention. Until a drawer was opened. Inside, tucked beneath old papers and notebooks, was an envelope. It wasn't sealed carefully. It didn't look dramatic. It looked ordinary, like something meant to be found, but only when the time was right. Inside was a letter. It wasn't a confession. There was no apology, no plea for forgiveness. It was a question. Eleanor wrote about the night of the fire,
about leaving the house before anything happened, about the uneasy feeling she couldn't explain, about a car she didn't recognize parked nearby, its engine still warm. She wrote about the smell of gasoline in the air after she had already walked away. She wrote about a man she had seen arguing with Thomas Reed days earlier, a man whose voice carried authority, a man people listened to, a man no one ever questioned. The letter didn't accuse, it simply pointed. It ended with one line: "I didn't do it, but I think I know who did." The name she wrote was familiar, powerful, respected, and already dead. The letter was passed quietly to the authorities, not announced, not discussed publicly, just enough to reopen a file that had never truly been examined. A second investigation followed, this time slowly, carefully, without assumptions. The evidence Eleanor had hinted at was still there: old reports, overlooked inconsistencies, details that no one had wanted to see the first time. The fire had been staged. The truth, once buried, surfaced without drama. Eleanor had been right all along, but she wasn't alive to hear it. There was no press release, no public apology, no announcement made at the church or printed in the local paper, just a correction buried deep in official paperwork. Her name was cleared on paper, but not in memory. The town never spoke of her again, not with guilt, not with regret, just silence, the kind that protects itself, because admitting the truth would mean admitting a choice had been made, and some truths, when they arrive too late, are treated as inconveniences rather than justice. This was what really happened.